The quiet beginning. It was a soft spring evening when Sandra Bullock found herself walking down a quiet street in Los Angeles, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She had been on countless sets, in countless scenes with countless people, but tonight felt different. Tonight was not a scene. Tonight was real. She was going to meet Keanu Reeves for dinner, just the two of them, after years of friendship that had quietly carried something unspoken beneath the surface. They had known each other since their days filming together. Their chemistry had always been easy, natural, unforced. But both had been careful, too careful, to protect what they valued most, their friendship. It was built on mutual respect, long talks after shoots, small moments when words didn't have to fill the silence. There was a comfort in that silence. But lately, that silence had begun to speak louder than their words. The restaurant was small, hidden between ivy-covered walls, the kind of place that didn't need fame to survive. Candles flickered inside and soft jazz played in the background. Sandra paused at the entrance, adjusting her jacket as she caught her reflection in the glass. She smiled at herself, not out of vanity, but out of nervousness. It had been years since she had felt nervous like this. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Keanu was already there, sitting by the window. He looked exactly the same. Calm, centered, his hands resting gently on the table, a half-smile on his face that seemed to say, "You made it, and everything is going to be okay." He stood up as she approached, that small, polite gesture he never forgot. It wasn't grand, but it carried weight. It was respect in its purest form. "You look beautiful," he said softly, almost hesitant, as if he didn't want to make her uncomfortable. She smiled back. "And you look like you just walked out of a movie set." He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "I think I just walked out of traffic." Their laughter broke the tension. For a moment, they were not two stars recognized everywhere they went. They were just two people sharing a meal, both quietly searching for something they couldn't name. As they ordered, their conversation wandered from work to memories. Sandra remembered the first time they met on set, how he had been so gentle with everyone. He never raised his voice, never demanded attention. He listened. He watched. He made people feel seen. And she realized again why people called him one of the kindest souls in Hollywood. It wasn't a performance. It was who he was. After the meal arrived, there was a pause. Keanu looked out the window for a long moment, his face thoughtful, as if caught between memory and now. Then he said something that changed the tone completely. "You know," he began, "sometimes I think people only see what they want to see. They see the smile, the calm face, the quiet man. But they never really see the weight someone carries." His voice was calm, but there was something fragile beneath it. Sandra didn't interrupt. She had learned that when Keanu spoke about pain, he did it rarely and with purpose. "You've always carried it well," she said quietly. "But I know it's there." He smiled faintly, but his eyes glistened in the candlelight. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just learned to walk with it." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deep, honest. It was the kind of silence that two people earn over years of shared understanding. Sandra's eyes softened. She reached for her glass, trying to mask the emotion rising inside her. She had seen his kindness, his patience, his humility, but she had never seen his vulnerability so clearly. It hit her unexpectedly hard. He looked at her then and smiled again, this time lighter, as if shaking off the heaviness. "But tonight's not about that. Tonight's just dinner with a friend who makes me laugh." She laughed, relieved by his warmth, but something inside her shifted. She realized that behind his calm presence, there was a man who carried grief like a shadow, quietly, without burdening anyone. And for some reason, she wanted to be the one person who could carry a little of it for him. After dinner, they stepped outside into the night air. The city lights reflected off wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. Sandra pulled her jacket tighter as a soft breeze moved through the street. Keanu noticed and, without saying a word, removed his own coat and draped it over her shoulders. She tried to protest, but his expression stopped her. It wasn't an offer, it was instinct. They started walking. The restaurant lights faded behind them as they wandered without direction, talking about everything and nothing. People passed by without realizing who they were. For a few blocks, they were invisible, and it felt freeing. Then, just as Sandra was about to make a lighthearted joke about how people always ship them together online, something unexpected happened. From across the street, a homeless man stumbled forward, clearly struggling. His blanket fell, and the few coins he had rolled into the gutter. Keanu immediately stepped off the curb without hesitation. Sandra watched as he knelt down, picked up the coins, and helped the man gather his things. No cameras, no audience, just kindness that expected nothing in return. The man mumbled something, gratitude, disbelief, and Keanu simply smiled and pressed a folded bill into his hand before walking back. He didn't look proud or heroic. He looked human. When he returned to Sandra's side, she didn't speak for a while. She just looked at him, truly looked. This was what made him different. Not his fame, not his charm, but the quiet goodness that seemed to live in every small choice he made. "You never change," she said finally, her voice low. He looked at her with a faint smile. "I hope I do. Change means growth." She shook her head gently. "I mean the part of you that still cares when no one's watching." He stopped walking for a second, meeting her eyes. "That's the only time it matters," he said softly. Something inside her broke open at that moment, not in pain, but in awe. She had known many good people in her life, but there was something about his sincerity that went beyond words. And she realized she was no longer just admiring him as a friend. She was seeing the man behind the mystery. As they reached her car, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said. He smiled lightly. "For dinner?" She shook her head. "For reminding me what real kindness looks like." He looked down for a moment, his voice quiet. "Kindness is easy when it's with the right person." The air grew still. The tension that had been building all evening now lingered between them, delicate but undeniable. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't form, maybe because she knew that once spoken, things would never be the same. Then Keanu looked at her again, and his eyes said everything his lips didn't. There was warmth, but also hesitation, an understanding that both of them were standing at the edge of something that could change everything. She smiled softly. "Good night, Keanu." He nodded. "Good night, Sandra." As she drove away, she glanced in the mirror. He was still standing there under the streetlight, hands in his pockets, watching the car disappear. And for reasons she couldn't explain, tears welled up in her eyes. That night, Sandra lay awake, replaying the evening. The laughter, the silence, the kindness, the unspoken emotions. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope mixed with fear. Because sometimes the most beautiful beginnings are the quiet ones that no one expects. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The moment everything changed, the next morning, Sandra woke up to sunlight streaming through her curtains. For a moment, she lay still, her mind replaying flashes of last night. The warmth in Keanu's eyes, the way he spoke about kindness, the quiet walk, the coat still hanging over the back of her chair. It still carried his scent, a faint mix of rain and cedar wood. She smiled softly but caught herself. She had no reason to smile, at least not one she could explain. The world outside her window was already moving fast again. Cars, calls, schedules, noise. She had interviews lined up, a script meeting in the afternoon, and a dinner invitation she'd been trying to avoid for weeks. Yet her mind kept circling back to one simple truth. Something about last night had changed her. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a reminder of something real, something she had stopped believing existed in her world of lights and lenses. Keanu, on the other hand, had already started his morning in his quiet, predictable way. Coffee in hand, a small notebook on his kitchen table, a few thoughts written in his slow, neat handwriting. He lived simply. No grand mansion, no chaos, no entourage. His peace came from small things. He stared at the page where he had written one line. Some moments don't need to be defined to matter. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sandra. "Thank you again for last night. I think I needed that more than I realized." He smiled slightly before typing back, "Me too." Then, after a few seconds of hesitation, he added, "Maybe we should do it again. This time, no cameras, no noise, just a drive." She stared at the message on her screen for a long time before replying, "I'd like that." 2 days later, they met again. Not in a restaurant this time, but on the open road. Keanu had suggested they drive along the coast, somewhere away from the flashing lights. He picked her up in his old motorcycle, the same one he'd kept for years. When she saw it, she laughed. "You're serious?" she said, raising an eyebrow. He grinned. "Always. Trust me, it's the best way to escape." She hesitated for a second, then took the helmet he offered. "Fine. But if we end up in the ocean, it's on you." The wind hit her face as they rode through winding roads overlooking the endless blue. The world blurred. The city disappeared, replaced by cliffs, trees, and the soft crash of waves below. She wrapped her arms around him, not out of fear, but because something in her heart told her it was exactly where she needed to be. They stopped at a quiet cliffside cafe, far from anyone who would recognize them. There were only 3 tables, an old man serving coffee, and the ocean stretching into forever. Keanu sat across from her, his eyes reflecting the sunlight. "This is where I come when things get loud," he said. "Up here, everything feels smaller. Even pain." She looked out at the sea. "You've always known how to disappear without running away." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's survival?" They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee, watching waves crash against the rocks below. Then, out of nowhere, Sandra asked, "Keanu, have you ever thought about love again?" The question surprised even her. It wasn't planned, but it slipped out, honest and raw. He looked down for a long time before answering. "I have, but I think love is quieter than people imagine. It's not fireworks, it's presence. It's staying when the world gets cold." His voice softened, almost breaking at the edges. "But sometimes I think it's not meant for everyone. Some people are here to heal others, not to be healed." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "That's not true. Everyone deserves to be seen, even the ones who give the most." He met her gaze, his eyes deep and calm. "You believe that?" "I do," she said, her voice trembling. "Because you deserve it too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with something they both understood but weren't ready to name. Then, just as the tension reached its quiet peak, the old man from the cafe came over, smiling. "You two look familiar," he said kindly. "But don't worry, I forget faces easily." They laughed, the spell broken. But the laughter carried something new, an awareness. Later that afternoon, they walked along the beach. Keanu carried his shoes, the sand cool under his feet. Sandra trailed behind, her thoughts heavy. She wanted to say something real, something that mattered. "Keanu," she finally said, "can I ask you something personal? Always, when you lost the people you loved, how did you keep going?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the horizon, the sun dipping low. "I didn't for a while. I just existed. I told myself that pain doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. One day it becomes quieter and you start breathing again." His words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. She had been through her own heartbreaks, her own silent nights. She knew what it meant to carry memories that refused to fade. She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "And what if someone reminds you how to breathe again?" He smiled softly. "Then you hold on to that person? Even if it scares you?" There was a long pause. Only the sound of the sea filled the space between them. Then she said quietly, "Maybe that's what I'm doing right now." His expression changed, gentle, surprised, but not uncertain.
"You mean this?"
"Yes," she whispered. "This." He took a slow step closer. "Not rushed, not bold, just honest." "Sandra," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you don't have to say anything more." "I understand." She smiled faintly, her eyes warm. "I know you do. That's what makes it harder." The moment was fragile, suspended between friendship and something deeper. And just as she thought he might reach for her hand, the sound of her phone broke the stillness. A sudden ring, sharp and intrusive. She checked the screen. It was her manager calling again. She sighed, declining the call. "You can answer," he said softly. "No," she replied, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Not this time." They continued walking until the sky turned gold. Neither of them said another word, but everything had already been said in silence. That night, as Sandra sat by her window, she opened her notebook and wrote something down, something she hadn't written in years. Sometimes the best people come quietly, without promises, without timing, without warning. They just stay. She closed the notebook and looked out at the stars, her heart full and unsure at the same time. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about fame or fear or what people might say. She was thinking about one man standing barefoot on a beach, teaching her how to breathe again, and deep down, she knew the world would soon find out, not because they wanted to tell, but because some truths are too bright to stay hidden forever. The world begins to notice. The next few weeks moved quietly, yet something between Sandra and Keanu had begun to change. They didn't call it love. They didn't label it at all. It was simply connection, calm, natural, undeniable. They would meet for coffee after long shoots, take late walks when the city was asleep, or just sit in silence on his porch, watching the world slow down. Theirs was not a loud bond. It was gentle, steady, the kind that grows between people who have known pain and learned to be careful with each other's hearts. But even the quietest stories eventually reach the world's ears. One morning, Sandra woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. Her messages were full of links, photos, and headlines. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves spotted together again. Is love in the air? Her stomach tightened as she scrolled. Someone had taken pictures of them at the cafe by the coast, another of them laughing near his motorcycle. Nothing inappropriate, nothing scandalous, and just honest moments. But the world had already started its guessing game. She stared at one picture for a long time, Keanu smiling at her as she looked down shyly. It wasn't posed. It wasn't staged. It was real. And that was what scared her the most. When she finally called Keanu, he answered calmly, as if he already knew. So, she said, half joking, we're apparently the internet's favorite love story now. He chuckled softly. I've seen worse rumors. Keanu, this could get messy, she said, her tone shifting. You know how they twist things. They'll make it look like a fairy tale or a scandal. Both are dangerous. He stayed silent for a few seconds. Then, with quiet confidence, he said, let them say what they want. We know what's real. She wanted to believe him. But she also knew the industry better than most. Fame had a way of turning sincerity into spectacle. That afternoon, when she stepped out for errands, paparazzi were waiting. Flashes went off. Questions flew like arrows. Sandra, is it true you're dating Keanu Reeves? How long have you two been seeing each other? She smiled politely, said nothing, and walked past them. Silence was her armor, but inside, her heart was racing. By evening, she was sitting in her kitchen, the lights off, her thoughts heavy. She didn't regret being seen with him. She regretted that the world couldn't let something beautiful exist quietly. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Keanu. Come outside. She frowned, stood up, and looked out her window. He was there, leaning against his motorcycle under the streetlight, wearing that familiar calm expression that seemed to melt away noise. She stepped out, still in her sweatshirt, hair tied up, no makeup. He looked up at her and smiled gently. Thought you might need some air, he said. She exhaled, half laughing. You really are impossible. He handed her a helmet. Good. Let's stay that way. They rode until the city disappeared again, the night air sharp and alive around them. When they stopped by the ocean, the moonlight reflected on the water like silver glass. Sandra got off the bike, her heart lighter. You always find peace in the strangest places, she said. He smiled. Maybe peace isn't about where you are. Maybe it's about who you're with. She turned to look at him, her breath catching slightly. You really believe that? I do, he said softly. Because when I'm with you, the noise stops. For a moment, neither of them moved. The waves filled the silence. The wind brushed against their faces, and time seemed to slow down. Keanu, she whispered, I don't know where this is going. He nodded, eyes steady. We don't have to. Maybe that's what makes it real. She looked down, smiling faintly. You make it sound so simple. He tilted his head, his tone almost teasing. It is simple. We just forget how to let it be, she sighed softly. The world won't leave it alone. He stepped closer, his voice calm. Then let them watch. We don't owe anyone a story. His words lingered in her chest like warmth. For a long time, she had lived in a world of scripts and expectations. But this felt unscripted, raw, imperfect, and deeply human. The next few days brought more attention. Interviews started hinting. Reporters asked vague questions, and fans filled social media with pictures of them smiling together. Instead of denying anything, Keanu did something no one expected. During a quiet press interview for his new project, when asked about Sandra, he smiled and said, "She's someone I deeply respect. She's one of the kindest people I know. Spending time with her reminds me of what really matters." The internet exploded. Sandra saw the clip later that night and couldn't stop smiling. He hadn't said anything dramatic. He hadn't claimed or confessed. He had simply spoken truth, calm, graceful, honest. And that honesty was more powerful than any headline. She called him that night. "You really know how to handle chaos," he laughed softly. "Truth doesn't need strategy." "Still," she said, "thank you. I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about me like that." "Then people haven't been paying enough attention," he said. The silence that followed was warm, filled with something unspoken. A few days later, they were invited to a private charity gala, separate invitations. But the organizers, of course, had seated them together. Sandra hesitated before agreeing. She knew how the cameras would feast on their presence. But when Keanu texted her, "Let's show up, for the cause, not the crowd," she smiled and said, "Yes." The night of the gala. She walked into the room wearing a simple black gown. Keanu was already there in his usual understated style. No arrogance, no flash. When their eyes met across the room, the noise faded. People noticed. Whispers spread, but neither of them cared. They greeted the guests, took photos with donors, and spoke about the charity's mission. Yet the moment that melted hearts came unexpectedly. While Sandra was giving her short speech, her voice wavered slightly as she spoke about kindness and how compassion changes lives. She mentioned that she recently met someone who reminded her of that truth. She didn't name him, but everyone knew. The camera caught Keanu's reaction, a small, genuine smile and eyes filled with pride. That clip would later circle the internet with the caption, "When words aren't needed." But behind the beauty of that night, something else began to stir, not from outside, but within. Sandra realized that the more time she spent with him, the more she was beginning to feel something deeper, something that scared her. She had built walls over the years, walls made of strength and independence, but Keanu had quietly stepped past them, not by force, but by simply being who he was. And for Keanu, the fear was different. He had lost too much before. Love, family, moments he could never get back. His heart was cautious, but every time he looked at her, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope without pain. As the night ended, they stood outside together, the city lights behind them. She looked at him and said softly, "You know, I don't think I've felt this alive in a long time." He smiled gently. "Then maybe we're both waking up again." She wanted to say something more, but instead, she just nodded. He opened the car door for her, as he always did, a small act of care that never felt rehearsed. As she drove away, the streets were quiet, but her heart wasn't. She knew what she was feeling now, and that realization came with a mix of joy and fear, because sometimes the scariest thing in the world isn't losing love. It's finding it again when you thought your heart had stopped looking, and deep down, she knew the next step would test everything between them. When hearts collide. The following weeks carried a strange mix of calm and tension. Sandra and Keanu were closer than ever, yet both seemed to sense the quiet storm forming beneath their peaceful connection. Their friendship had transformed into something heavier, more magnetic, something that neither of them could completely control anymore. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't wild. It was slow, deep, and frighteningly real. One evening, Sandra sat in her home garden, the air filled with the smell of wet earth after a light rain. She was reading a script, but her focus drifted to her phone. She wanted to text him, to tell him something simple, maybe a joke, maybe a thought, but she hesitated. Lately, she caught herself thinking about him too often, waiting for his messages, rewatching their moments in her mind. She was no longer sure if it was friendship, admiration, or love. Just as she sighed and set the phone down, it buzzed. It was him. "Are you free tonight?" "I made something," she smiled. "Something like dinner or trouble?" "Hopefully both," he replied. When she arrived at his house, the evening sun had already softened into gold. Keanu greeted her at the door wearing an apron over a black t-shirt, his hair tied back, laughter in his eyes. "You cooked?" she asked, stepping inside. Amused. "Well," he said, pretending to think. "Let's call it an experiment with edible results." The table was set simply, candles, soft music, 2 plates of pasta that actually looked decent. She couldn't help but smile. "I didn't think you did this kind of thing," he shrugged. "I don't. But I figured there's a first time for everything." They ate, they laughed, and for a while everything felt effortless. Yet underneath that comfort, there was something unsaid pressing against every glance, every pause. After dinner, they moved to the balcony. The city lights shimmered below them, the air warm and still. Sandra leaned on the railing while Keanu sat beside her, quiet, thoughtful. "You've been quieter than usual," she said softly. He nodded slowly. "Because for the first time in a long time, I don't want to say the wrong thing." She turned to him, heart beating faster. "Why would you?" He took a breath, his voice low and sincere. "Because what's between us? It matters, and I don't want to ruin it by saying too much or too little." Her throat tightened. She looked away, eyes glistening. "I feel it too, you know." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You do?" "Every time you talk," she whispered. "It feels like you're saying something I've been afraid to admit to myself." The silence that followed was fragile, stretched between them like glass. Keanu took a slow step closer. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried a storm. "Then maybe it's time we stop being afraid." She met his gaze, her heart in freefall. "And what happens if we're wrong?" "Then we'll still have the truth," he said softly. There was a long pause, and then for the first time he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, gentle, deliberate. The world seemed to disappear. No noise, no past, no fear, just the quiet thrum of connection that had been waiting to surface. She didn't pull away. Her eyes closed for a moment as if memorizing the feeling. But just as the moment deepened, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the stillness. Keanu sighed and stepped back, checking the screen. It was his manager. "Sorry," he murmured, turning to answer. She watched him as he spoke. Calm, collected, professional. Yet inside her chest, everything felt fragile. She suddenly realized how much this mattered to her, how easily it could all slip away. After he hung up, she smiled faintly to cover her unease. "Back to reality." He nodded, sensing the shift in her tone. "You okay?" "Yeah," she lied softly. "Just tired." He didn't press. They talked for a while longer, but something invisible had crept between them. Not distance, but fear. The kind that comes when something beautiful starts to feel too real. The next day, Sandra was back on set. The director's voice echoed, cameras moved, lines were repeated, everything looked the same. Yet inside, she was different. She missed the calm of his presence. She missed how his silence felt safer than most people's words. During a break, she scrolled through her phone and saw a new article trending. Keanu Reeves in talks for an international project, filming to begin abroad. Her heart sank. He hadn't mentioned it. Later that evening, she texted him, "So, you're leaving?" After a minute, he replied, "It's not official yet. They just reached out." "Where?" "Tokyo." 6 months. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She wanted to ask if that meant goodbye, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she typed, "You should take it. You've earned it." His reply came after a long pause. "That's not what I wanted to hear from you." She stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She typed and deleted several messages before finally sending one. "I don't want to be the reason you stay." His response was immediate. "You're not the reason I'd stay. You're the reason I'd want to come back." She sat in silence, tears slipping down her face before she even realized it. A few nights later, they met again, this time not in a restaurant or on a beach, but in the quiet corner of a park they both loved. It was late, almost midnight. He was sitting on a bench when she arrived, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired but soft. Neither of them spoke for a while. The city hummed faintly in the distance. "So it's really happening?" she asked finally. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's a big project, but I don't know if I want to do it." "Why not?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Because I've finally found peace here," he said. "And leaving feels like tearing it apart." She looked at him, her heart aching. "You can't build your life around me, Keanu." "I'm not," he said softly. "But maybe you're part of the life I want to build." Her breath caught. The simplicity of his words made them more powerful. She sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "And what happens when you're gone? When the world pulls you back in?" He turned his head, eyes meeting hers. "Then you'll still be here and I'll still be me. And if that's real, it won't fade." She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that time and distance couldn't break something built on truth. But part of her had been here before, waiting, hoping, losing. "I'm scared," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "So am I. That's how you know it's real." The clock tower nearby chimed, echoing through the still air. He reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly. "Promise me one thing," he said. "No matter what happens, don't let the noise make you doubt this." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I promise." They sat there under the pale light, two souls quietly making a promise that neither of them could fully explain. And as the wind moved through the trees, she realized that love doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it just arrives, quietly, fully, and impossibly right. But she also knew that the world rarely lets love like this remain untouched. And deep down, both of them could feel it. Something was coming. Something that would test everything they had built. The distance between hearts, the morning air was cool when Sandra stood by her window, holding the cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Outside, Los Angeles glowed under the first light of dawn, but inside her heart, everything felt heavy. It had been 3 weeks since Keanu left for Tokyo, 3 long weeks that somehow felt like months. Their last night together had ended with quiet words, soft promises, and a final hug that lingered a little too long. She had told him she was proud of him, that he needed to go, that she'd be fine. She had said it with a smile. But the moment he disappeared beyond the airport gates, something inside her shifted, like a door closing, softly but completely. They texted every day at first. Short, warm messages that made the distance bearable. He would send pictures of the city lights or little notes about his shoots. She would reply with jokes or videos of her clumsy dog knocking over furniture. But slowly, the messages began to slow down. Not because they cared less, but because life had its way of taking space. One evening, as Sandra finished her shoot, her phone lit up. It was a video call from Keanu. She smiled before answering. His face appeared tired but kind, framed by the glow of neon lights. "Hey, you look beautiful, even in low Wi-Fi," he teased. She laughed softly. "And you look like you haven't slept in a week." "You're not wrong," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It's been intense. Different kind of world here. You always adapt," she said. "You make everything look easy." He smiled faintly. "Not everything." His eyes lingered for a second too long, and she felt that same familiar ache in her chest. They talked for a while, about his work, her days on set, little things that didn't really matter but meant everything. But near the end, his tone shifted. "They've extended the shoot," he said quietly. "Another 2 months." She froze for a moment. "Oh, I didn't want to tell you over text," he added quickly. "I didn't even decide yet," she forced a smile. "You should do it. It's good for you." "That's not what I wanted to hear," he said softly, echoing the same words he had once used before leaving. She looked away, blinking fast. "You know I'll support you, Keanu, always." "And that's what makes it harder," he replied, his voice low. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the call dropped. Bad signal, bad timing. Maybe both. She stared at the blank screen, the reflection of her own face staring back. Strong, composed, breaking. A few days later, Sandra attended a charity event alone. The cameras flashed, the crowd smiled, and reporters asked questions that all felt the same. But that night, when she stood on stage to speak about compassion and human resilience, her voice trembled. She caught herself mid-sentence, blinking away tears she didn't expect. Afterward, a young journalist approached her. "Your speech was moving," she said. "You spoke about loss like you've lived it deeply." Sandra smiled gently. "We all have. We just carry it differently." That night, when she got home, she opened her notebook again, the one she had started writing in since the night of their first dinner. She wrote, "Distance is strange. It doesn't kill love. It teaches it how to breathe differently." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Keanu sat in his apartment staring out at the skyline. He had just finished another exhausting day of filming, but his mind wasn't on the movie. It was on her. He thought about her laughter, her warmth, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about kindness. He reached for his phone more than once, typed messages, deleted them, and finally just sent one. "Still thinking about that night on the balcony," she replied 10 minutes later. "Me too." He smiled faintly, closing his eyes, but their time zones made everything harder. When she was asleep, he was awake. When he had a moment to breathe, she was filming. Weeks blurred into months. Their connection remained, but it began to ache like a quiet wound, not open, not healed. One night, Sandra received a message that shook her. It wasn't from him, but from a reporter she knew, a photo of Keanu attending a late-night dinner with his co-stars. One picture showed him smiling at a woman across the table. It wasn't romantic, not really, but the headline was enough to twist her heart. She didn't reply to him that day, or the next. Her silence was not punishment. It was confusion. She didn't know what she felt. Jealousy, fear, or maybe just the weight of distance pressing down on everything they hadn't said. 3 days later, he finally texted. "You've been quiet." She hesitated, then typed, "Just tired. Are you okay?" She paused again before replying, "I miss home." His next message came quickly. "So do I." The following week, something unexpected happened. Keanu wrapped filming earlier than expected. He didn't tell anyone, not even her. Instead, he booked an early flight back to Los Angeles. It was late evening when Sandra returned home from work. She unlocked the door, exhausted, only to freeze at the sight before her. He was there, sitting on her porch steps, his duffel bag beside him, the same calm smile on his face. "You're here?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He stood, eyes soft. "I couldn't wait anymore." For a long moment, she just stared, as if afraid that moving would make him vanish. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Not gently, but with all the weight of the weeks that had passed without him, his arms wrapped around her, steady, certain. "I missed you," he whispered. She pulled back slightly, her eyes shining. "I thought you were staying longer." "I was supposed to," he said. "But I realized something." "What?" "No place feels right without the people who make it home." Her breath caught. "Keanu," he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not saying this to make it complicated. I'm saying it because it's true." The porch light flickered softly above them, the night quiet except for the faint hum of the city. She looked up at him, trembling between tears and laughter. "You have a terrible sense of timing," he grinned. "Maybe, but I finally got it right." That night, they sat on her couch, sharing tea, stories, and long silences that didn't need words. For the first time in months, the distance was gone. Not because they had planned it, but because something stronger than timing had pulled them back together. As the hours passed, Sandra leaned against his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "the world will see this, twist it, turn it into something else." He nodded. "Let them. We'll live the truth quietly," she smiled faintly. "You really believe that?" He looked down at her, his voice low. "I believe in us." For the first time in her life, those words didn't scare her. They felt like home. And yet, deep inside, she knew every piece they found together seemed to be followed by another test. The world had already started talking again, louder than before. But this time, they weren't hiding, and that made all the difference. When love finally spoke, the days that followed were slow and quiet, almost sacred. Keanu stayed in Los Angeles, away from cameras, away from press. He didn't make grand gestures, didn't fill the silence with promises. He just stayed. Sometimes that's all it takes to prove love is real. Every morning, Sandra woke up to find a small note by her coffee machine. Nothing dramatic, just simple words like, "Good morning," "Sunshine," or "Don't forget to breathe today." She would smile each time, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. But the calm didn't last long. It never does. One afternoon, as Sandra stepped out of her home, she was surrounded by reporters again. Someone had leaked a photo, the one of her and Keanu sitting close on her porch, their heads leaning together. It spread everywhere within hours. Headlines screamed, "Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, secret romance finally confirmed." The internet exploded. Fans rejoiced, others speculated, and the media turned their quiet story into a circus. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from her manager, her publicist, her friends. Everyone wanted answers. That night, she sat on her couch, her head in her hands. Keanu arrived a few minutes later, calm as always. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They'll make it bigger than it is." He looked at her quietly. "And what is it, Sandra?" She froze. "What do you mean?" He took a slow breath. "We've spent months pretending we don't know what this is." "I'm done pretending." His voice was soft but firm. She looked at him, her heart pounding. "Keanu, you know what this world does. It twists things, ruins good people. I can't lose everything I've built because of a story they want to sell." He nodded slowly, his eyes steady. "Then let me say something the world can't twist." He took her hand gently, his thumb tracing her palm. "I love you, Sandra. Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because it's real. You've seen every quiet part of me and stayed. I don't need the world to understand that. I just need you to." Her eyes filled instantly. She had waited her whole life for words that simple and that honest. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." "Me too," he said softly, smiling through it. "But maybe that's how we know it's worth it." For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. There was no noise, no headlines, no expectations. Just two souls who had finally stopped running. She reached up, cupping his face, and whispered, "Then don't go anywhere." He smiled gently. "I wasn't planning to," and for the first time she kissed him. Slow, certain, quiet. There were no fireworks, no music, no cinematic cues. Just breath and closeness and everything they'd been holding back for months. The following week, both of them decided to face it openly. They attended a charity event together, the same organization that had once sparked the rumors. When they walked in, hand in hand, the room fell silent for a moment before applause filled the air. But what happened next silenced even the cameras. During the event, Sandra spoke again, her voice steady, her presence calm. "Sometimes," she said, looking out at the audience, "the people we meet remind us of the goodness we almost forgot existed. They teach us that kindness still matters, that love can be gentle, and that strength doesn't always mean standing alone. I found someone who reminded me of that, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. She didn't name him, but she didn't have to. Keanu's eyes glistened as he listened from the table, his hands clasped together. Afterward, reporters tried to crowd them again, but something had changed. This time, their silence wasn't defensive. It was peace. They didn't hide, but they didn't perform either. They simply lived. Months passed. Their relationship grew quietly, outside of cameras and chaos. Sometimes they traveled together. Sometimes they spent weeks apart. But they always found their way back, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Their friends noticed it most, the calmness in her laughter, the warmth in his smile. There was no drama, no jealousy, no pretending. It was two people who had learned that love wasn't about perfection or attention. It was about choosing each other. Again and again, in a noisy world that never stops testing you. One evening, they returned to the same restaurant where it all began, the small one with ivy on the walls and candles on the tables. The owner recognized them immediately and smiled quietly. As they sat by the same window, Keanu looked at her with that same half-smile from months ago. "You remember the first time we sat here?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "I remember everything." He leaned closer, his voice low. "So do I. That was the night everything started changing." "And now?" she asked. He smiled. "Now it just feels right." They sat there in silence for a while, the candlelight flickering between them. There was no need for grand words anymore. They had already said everything that mattered, not through interviews or statements, but through the way they had shown up for each other when the world tried to pull them apart. As the waiter placed dessert on the table, Sandra looked out the window. The same view, the same soft glow of city lights. She reached across the table, took his hand, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "Thank you for letting me stay." The music played softly in the background, the kind of slow jazz that had filled the air that very first night. Everything had come full circle, not like a movie ending, but like life settling into peace. And when they left the restaurant, walking into the night hand in hand, people noticed them again. Flashes went off, voices called their names, but this time neither of them looked away. They just smiled at each other, unbothered, real, complete. Because some love stories don't need to be shouted from rooftops. They just need to be lived quietly, sincerely, until the world learns to see the beauty in calm hearts. And as they disappeared down the quiet street, under the same soft glow of a streetlight that had witnessed their first goodbye, the world finally understood it. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories aren't about sparks. They're about light that never fades.